In many ways, the 1850s are where everything began to go wrong. Not only did the second two-party system break down, and the men who had become national leaders during the War of 1812 passed from the national scene, and indeed from their lives, the United States was increasingly polarized. In the North, the anti-slavery movement, although still seen as something of a fringe movement, was becoming more powerful. And furthermore, increasingly inspired by works of fiction, such as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and by resentment of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which required Northerners to serve as slave catchers, essentially, for the South. On the other hand, Southerners, who for generations had accepted that slavery was morally questionable, at least, and ideologically incompatible with the Declaration of Independence, but had described it as a necessary evil that we were stuck with, now began to describe slavery not merely as a necessary evil, but as a positive good. And the North and the South increasingly came to see each other as two separate societies, a decade before they became two separate countries. And a lot of the tension, too, came from what should have been a great victory for America, as in 1848, the United States gained control of almost a third of northern Mexico, having already annexed the Republic of Texas in late 1845. In 1846 and 47, the United States fought with Mexico along the disputed border between our two countries, counting Texas as part of the United States, or possibly not, from Mexico's point of view, and in a full-scale invasion of Mexico, ending with Winfield Scott's brilliant conquest of Mexico City. But the problem then came to be how to deal with all this new land. We've already mentioned the Compromise of 1850, which allowed California to become a free state, throwing the Senate out of balance. But there were other issues too, such as how to get from the east to the west. The Pony Express existed briefly. Ships sailed all the way around the southern tip of South America, returning eventually to California. Others sailed to Panama or Nicaragua and took overland routes from there to the Pacific coast and other ships from there. There was even a scheme to import camels to travel across the great American desert. And some were purchased in North Africa, but being contrary creatures, the camels never learned English, and they had to hire trainers in Syria to speak to the camels in Arabic. That plan was also unsuccessful, although camels that escaped into the wild remained in the Southwest at least into the early 20th century. The real need was for a railroad, but the question then was where to build it. Southerners, of course, wanted it in the South for political and economic advantages. Northerners in the north, or at least the middle of the country. But politically, the South in some ways did make the most sense. Texas and California were both states, and the area in between was organized as the territory of New Mexico. Sparsely populated, it was true, but with an actual territorial government, which some of the plains did not have at all. Furthermore, from an engineering point of view, the easiest route through the Rocky Mountains was near their southern end, near the southern border, or actually just past the southern border of Arizona as it stood then, which the United States resolved by purchasing what's now southern Arizona from Mexico for $10 million in 1853, that being known as the Gadsden Purchase. This, of course, was unpopular in the north because it opened up a southern route for the railroad and seemed like a lot of money to pay for what was otherwise a trackless desert. And so the southern route was not actually built for some time. So there was an attempt in 1854 to start building a railroad in through the unorganized territories of the Great Plains, which the Little Giant, the senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, proposed organizing as the Kansas and Nebraska territories through the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which passed despite having the very controversial aspect of popular sovereignty included. whereby the people of the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska would vote for themselves if they wanted to permit slavery or not in the states that would eventually form there, then essentially ignoring the Missouri Compromise, which the Compromise of 1850 had partially thrown out anyway. People flooded to Kansas, largely people from the north who wanted to settle cheap land there and who did not want to compete with slave labor, preferring to be small, independent farmers. They were even encouraged in this by the New England Colonization Society, which hoped to move opponents of slavery into Kansas and also make money in the process, being both an ideological endeavor and a business venture. So the majority of people living in Kansas probably opposed slavery. But when the time came to elect a territorial legislature, large numbers of people rushed in from neighboring Missouri, so-called border ruffians, and managed to flood the polls with their votes, electing a territorial government in Lecompton, which created a territorial constitution permitting slavery. The opponents of slavery said this was an illegitimate government, and so created their own government, which itself was also illegal, not having been created by the official elections there in Topeka. And a Topeka constitution banned slavery. The President of the United States at the time, Franklin Pierce, accepted the Lecompton Constitution with slavery. Pierce, like his successor, James Buchanan, being a type of Democrat known as a dough-face, which was a Northern Democrat supportive of the South to try to hold the country together, as the Democrats tried to retain their role as a national party, even without the Whigs as an opposing national party anymore. And the partial replacement for the Whigs, the Republican Party, which was formed from former Free Soilers, anti-slavery Whigs, know-nothings, as opponents of immigration were known then, and even some anti-slavery Democrats, was purely a Northern party, or largely a Northern party. There were some members in the Upper South, but Maryland and Missouri are not the same as South Carolina or Mississippi. So, Congress concluded that most people in Kansas did not support slavery and refused to accept the Lecompton Constitution, but when they tried to accept the Topeka Constitution, Presidents Pierce and Buchanan refused to accept that. So Kansas did not get to become a state for several years. However, the people there on both sides were well armed and began to fight each other in what was known as Bleeding Kansas, starting around 1856, in which pro and anti-slavery people massacred each other, largely shooting one another, but in the infamous Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, John Brown and several of his sons chopped up pro-slavery men with swords. There was even violence on the floor of Congress, where pro-slavery South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks beat anti-slavery Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner nearly to death with his cane, after Sumner insulted the South and South Carolina, and Brooks' uncle, who was a senator from South Carolina, in a pretty insulting speech. Sumner survived, but only barely, and spent years getting specialized medical treatment in Europe. And then things got worse, as in 1857, the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case declared that Dred Scott, who was suing for his freedom because while a slave he had lived in free states for many years, had his case rejected on the grounds that, being a slave, he could not sue. But the Supreme Court went further and said that the Founding Fathers had never meant for black people to have rights, and therefore no black person could sue. And furthermore, because a person cannot lose their property without trial, thanks to the Fifth Amendment, there is no way a slave could automatically be freed simply by crossing the border into a free state, thus essentially throwing out the distinction between free and slave states. A state might ban the sale of slaves, but they could not ban the ownership of them. So if you really wanted slaves in, say, Minnesota, you simply had to purchase them in Missouri and bring them north. This infuriated Northerners and troubled many people because it clearly threw out the Missouri Compromise, which, though it had been badly weakened, was still seen as very important. And then things got worse, as in 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown launched an attack on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now in West Virginia, hoping to seize the federal arsenal there, use the weapons there to arm Southern slaves, and begin a massive slave uprising, first carving out a free territory in Appalachia, and from there eventually leading to a slave uprising across the South. Although he did seize the arsenal, he was rapidly captured and shortly afterwards executed for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia. Slaves did not rise up. Most, of course, had no idea this was happening, and even if they had, they probably would not have rebelled. The few slave uprisings to actually take place in U.S. history having ended very badly for those slaves who took part or even suspected of having possibly taken part. Although many Northerners felt Brown's methods were bad, many admired him as a martyr, willing to give his life for the anti-slavery cause, and Southerners saw, or believed they saw, a North ready to attack them, a North that already was ignoring the fugitive slave law, which had really been the only thing the South had gotten out of the Compromise of 1850.